Hey there, Colin Marshall here, host of the Marketplace of Ideas. If you enjoy the show and you'd like to help make it bigger, stronger, smarter, faster, longer, more in-depth, whatever you want it to be, make sure you blog about it, tweet about it, email about it, live journal about it, Facebook about it, whatever you need to do to get the word out, because the more people know about the Marketplace of Ideas, the better it can be. This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about aesthetics and evolutionary biology with Denis Dutton, professor of the philosophy of art at the University of Canterbury, founder and editor of Arts and Letters Daily, as well as the author of The Art Instinct, Beauty, Pleasure, and Human Evolution. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Denis Dutton is a professor of the philosophy of art at the University of Canterbury and the founder, editor, and as Roger Kimball calls him, the presiding spirit of the web portal Arts and Letters Daily. His new book is The Art Instinct, Beauty, Pleasure, and Human Evolution. Denis, welcome back to the program.
Colin, I'm delighted to be here.
This interview comes fairly late in the promotional process for you for this book. You've done so many interviews already, and I think I might have heard all the ones that made it to the internet and read them as well. You've managed to most famously make it on, and I'm going to use the pronunciation that's correct here, the Colbert Report. Now, I couldn't help but feel my head explode a little bit when I saw a work of aesthetics, essentially, of the philosophy of art on a program like that. How did that happen? How did that come together?
You couldn't have been more surprised than I was. I'd been, a few days before, I'd been on Brian Lehrer's program on WNYC in New York, and it would go on very nicely. We were cut down with time because of some pressing news that had infringed on the program, but Colbert's producer was listening and parked her car and continued to listen to the end of the interview, and then called my publisher, and there I was on the Colbert Report. I mean, that was an experience in itself, I must say.
It was actually that simple. It was simply, it appealed to the producer, and there you were? It
appealed to the producer, yes. He just simply liked the idea of the book and thought that he could do something with it, which he certainly did. I mean, one has to say he's a witty guy. He's a very warm and friendly chap. It's very good, however, not to have to share a stage with him, because whatever you try to do, he'll make mincemeat of you, which he did in the nicest way, and I accepted it.
It seems like he went fairly easy on you, although you're not. I don't think that you're the kind of figure that the real Stephen Colbert finds offensive in any way.
Well, what he tends to do is to savage people with pretensions, or people who badly want to get on the program, or people who are trying to sell the world what he considers to be a bill of goods of some kind. At least in the case of The Art Instinct, it was a book about philosophical aesthetics and evolution, and appealed to him, appealed to his producer. So that's why I was invited on. It was really their idea rather than my agent's idea. Maybe they felt he had to be a little bit well-behaved because of it. Who knows?
But I would think that you two would be kindred spirits because of that, because if a listener recalls our previous conversation on this show, we talked a lot about the bad writing contest. I mean, you two are not unknown to deflate a few inflated figures.
Yes, I think that's true. The Art Instinct is trying to give a new view of aesthetics, of what in general would be called literary theory, and there is a certain sense in which it's deflationary. It's not reductionist. I am, if anything, wanting to go back and respect the glory of the greatest works of art and the place that they have in our lives. On the other hand, we have been stuck, I think, for the last generation, 30 years or so, with forms of literary and critical theory, which really belong to our grandparents by now. It's grandma's literary theory, pretentious, overblown, badly written, obscure, difficult to understand on purpose, not because the issues are difficult. And gosh, I think if anybody can do anything, as I'm trying to do, and a few others are, Joe Carroll and Brian Boyd and so forth, if anybody can do anything to actually put the arts in a new light, in a way that I think is generally intelligible to any educated reader, well, that's what I'd like to see.
The word you mentioned a few seconds ago, reductive. Now, this is something I'm going to have to bring up because I've been reading a lot of discussion about the art instinct and about the kinds of topics the art instinct tackles, even if not directly related to the book. And this is something that comes up a lot, this word. You just said you're trying not to be reductive, and from the humanities side of academia, there's a lot of fear about who's going to be reductive, kind of pointing out, find the kind of a witch trial of finding who's going to be reductive, and then it's in talk of your book, reviews say you're either reductive here or not reductive there. Why is reductivity, and what is it, I guess, but why is it such a big issue in this whole discussion?
Oh, very good question, and a big question. In a sense, all explanation is reductive. That is to say, if I take Don Quixote or the Iliad or the Beethoven Pastoral Symphony and I say anything about it or I write about it, and I'm trying to say something that sheds light on it, which is not it itself, then I'm reducing. That is to say, I'm trying to concentrate on those elements that I think are most salient, most relevant to experience, and of course that's what I'm trying to do in the book. In a sense, all criticism does that. I mean, I think part of the problem with criticism in the last 30 or 40 years is this tendency to reduce everything to rather predictable politics. You find that in post-colonial theory, you find it in feminist theory applied to the arts, you find it in political theory and economic theory. What I'm trying to do is to get underneath all of this to explain why it is that the arts enrapture us, why they so appeal to us, without actually reducing them to something which is very simple-minded. Because the explanation, I think that the only explanation that can fly for the arts, if it's an evolutionary explanation, respects their tremendous complexity and the way in which they stimulate the mind in ways that actually tax the intelligence and the emotions to their ultimate extent in the imagination. I think that's what evolution can do, and it does a better job than a lot of the criticism that we've had in the last 40 years. But yeah, reduction and this is a reductive explanation. One of the nice things that I note in the Boston Globe in a review that appeared very recently in the Boston Globe is that the chap began immediately by saying this book is not reductive, but rather respects the complexity of the arts, and that's what I wanted.
Now, you can tell me if you've observed the same thing, because you've surely seen a lot more of this, having been in the academy. But when I hear an accusation from one party to another, especially within academia, of being too reductive, it seems like what they really mean is that when they say you're being too reductive, they mean you're reducing to the wrong things.
The wrong thing, exactly. Exactly. You're not reducing to my pet politics, or you're not reducing to my particular obsessions. You found something else to reduce to. Take, for example, the argument in the first chapter of the book, which is on landscape. In the first chapter of the book, I argue that if you look at the history of landscape painting, if you look at calendars across the world that have landscape, at beautiful landscape books with nice color pictures of landscape in them, of course, all through the history of art as well, chocolate boxes, you name it. What you find is that people seem to like certain kinds of elements over and over again in landscapes. They like open areas with copses of trees. They like trees that fork near the ground. They like to have water in landscapes. They like to have landscapes which have some view of the horizon visible somewhere in the distance. And they like to have some kind of a winding road that seems to go into the distance. Now, there are good ways in which you can mount, as I try to do in the first chapter, an argument that this is a Pleistocene response to landscapes. And what we're responding to here are landscapes which would have been the most favorable to us in evolutionary history, back in the Pleistocene in the savannas of Africa, where we evolved. What I'm not doing is, I hope, reducing all landscape art to these particular descriptions. I'm just pointing out that you do see these over and over again. On top of that, what you have are styles. You have the same landscapes, in Chinese art. You have them in Japanese art, but it's in a Japanese style or a Chinese style. You have it in Constable. You have it in the Hudson River School. So there's style and culture built all around this underlying substratum, which is genetically hardwired, and it's the kind of response that we have to landscapes and beautiful landscapes. It seems to me that it's a mistake to reduce everything to culture or to reduce everything to nature, because our response to life is a combination of nature and culture. If you put that together, then you begin to understand the whole history of landscape art, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Now, just by that last response, I can tell that this question of whether you have tried to reduce art to pure biology has been one you've had to vociferously, not shout down, but reason people out of as you've done this book tour.
Yes, it's true. It does come up. And I think it's because there's an argument here between two sides that are doing rather different things. One side, as I see it, does include extreme elements. And what I mean by that is social constructionists who really, truly believe that all of our artistic values and our tastes, our likes and our dislikes, are determined by culture. They are true reductionists. They reduce everything to culture. There's no one on the other side, on my side, saying everything is nature. Of course it's not. Of course culture is omnipresent in the world of the arts. It gives us our styles, our traditions. It gives us sets of expectations, things that we sort of are familiar with in the arts, make surprise and invention possible. All I'm saying, and all the biological or evolutionary estheticians are saying, is that in addition to the cultural element, there is this natural element, and a proper understanding of the arts combines the two. That's the idea. In other words, I'm not trying to be a mirror image of the other side and saying it's all nature. That wouldn't make any sense at all. And I think it makes no sense to say it's all culture. There's some middle ground which we have to achieve.
Now, we've gotten pretty far straight into the meat of the book, but we should probably step back a bit. And I don't want to make you repeat the premises of the book as you've done in so many interviews so far. So I tried to do a little bit of reduction myself, and I was trying to think of some good 5-word summaries of the thesis of the book, and maybe you can tell me how on target I've gotten. The first one, the first 5-word thesis here, art appreciation is biologically rooted. How well did I do there?
I think that's fine. I think it's biologically rooted in the same way that the construction of the family and societies are biologically rooted. Language is biologically rooted. Our whole status as a social species is biologically rooted. That is, I think, quite right.
Okay, number 2 is evolution gave us our tastes.
Half right.
Oh, okay.
Evolution gives us our taste to some extent. Culture also gives us our tastes. And where we are in a cultural tradition gives us our tastes. That is to say, if we try to imagine that we were having this conversation in 1790, and we were, through some time machine, confronted with The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky, I don't even think we would recognize that it could be a piece of music. It can only be a piece of music when you go through the 19th century. You have a certain set of cultural expectations that are built into the culture of music, which have widened your sense of possibilities to the point where finally you get to The Rite of Spring and you can see, yes, that's certainly violent and weird and strange, but it is a piece of music. So I think that, I won't say it completely gives us our tastes, but the very fact that we have tastes at all, I think is biologically formed. That is to say, I think there's some evolutionary elements involved in the whole idea of expectation, of liking, of disliking, of finding something beautiful, of finding something ugly. But, how that plays out is very complex in any particular case.
And before I hit number 3 of the 5-word condensation, I want to kind of veer off on a digression here about kind of what you just said. It must be, or tell me if this was really the challenge that I think it was. I feel like the primary challenge in this kind of analysis that you're putting together is drawing a line between biology and culture where one ends and the other begins? Because certainly it wouldn't be a terribly unreasonable statement to make to say that to call culture a phenomenon that emerges from biology.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we are biologically determined to be cultural animals. And, I mean, that sounds strange to say it, but it's not a contradiction. We are actually built to be, for example, language-using animals. Now, of course, the languages that we speak have words, have conventions, which are different all over the world, but not so different that languages can't be translated into each other. So we have a basic repertoire of emotions, a basic repertoire cross-culturally of facial expressions. So if you take those two repertoires together, you put them up against a descriptive power, a conceptual power of language. Language itself is governed at a deep level. I certainly refer to Chomsky here, at a deep level by certain structures, which are probably biologically, certainly are to some extent, and in some ways biologically determined. But then on top of that, you have the whole historical phenomenon of culture too, which means that we are in some respects like people who lived 100,000 years ago, and we are in some respects very different from people that lived 100,000 years ago. But you're right. The problem is to know where to draw the line with anything. I mean, take, for example, music. Take a very simple fact about music. Musical works, whether they are Western symphonies or Indian ragas, tend, by and large, over a long period of time, if it's a long work, to somehow manage to increase emotion and often to increase rhythmic speed in the work. That is to say, there are a few symphonies, such as, for example, the Tchaikovsky Pathetique Symphony, that end with a slow movement. But most symphonies, though they have a slow movement, don't end with a slow movement, they end with a fast movement, just as most ragas end with a very fast jala or some kind of rhythmic element that's very fast. Well, that has to do with the basic structure of how human attention is kept by anything. That is to say, attention flags, so there has to be either more emotion in the opera, more rhythm, more, say, frenetic pace in the music, whatever it is. In a story, it can be a piece of music. It doesn't have to simply be music. But the structure of the way we respond to temporal arts is built into how human attention works and how it works biologically. We need an increase in speed in order to keep the same amount of attention. Now, of course, there are many exceptions to that, but you find that that's a cross-cultural fact. Of course, it's different the way it's expressed in different cultures, but it nevertheless is a cross-cultural truth. And that seems to me a kind of thing where you're talking about a biological underlay, as you put it, over a culture which is on top of all of this and which makes for a lot of cultural change.
Do you know how clearly we can see the spectrum? I mean, of course, we can identify the things that are very cultural and the things that are very biological, but how clearly can we piece out the middle of the spectrum between biology and culture? I mean, I know we're not going to draw a clear dividing line, but how close can we get to that?
Well, the only way you could, I think, get a clear view of it, or the clearest view that you could have, would be as much as possible to study arts cross-culturally, to understand arts outside of your own culture. I mean, it's Kipling's old remark, how does he know England who only England knows? How do you know your own arts if you don't know other arts? How do you know the arts of your own culture if you don't know other cultures? So you have to look outside cultures, and then you have to reflectively think about what different arts have in common, and then you have to ask yourself, well, do they have these things in common because of some kind of basic mental hardwiring, or is it a fact of simply physics that the arts turn out to have certain aspects in common? I mean, there are plenty of things which are cross-cultural universals, such as, for example, you have to ride a bicycle at a certain speed in order that it not fall over. If you're going too slowly, the bicycle falls over. You have to get up to a certain speed just to keep it going. That's a fact of physics. It's a fact of the gyroscopic motion of the bicycle wheels that you can go upright. It's not culturally determined, Nor is it innate in our minds in any way either. It's just a fact of life that you have to have this. Well, if we think about the arts would include lots of contingent facts about physics and about perception. They would include contingent facts about the way we evolved to perceive the world. And then we have all of the cultural facts about the arts themselves. I mean, that's at a very high level of abstraction, the way I'm describing it. But it's a question for which I don't think there is any magic answer. There's no magic key to this. There just is a lot of observation that has to be done and a lot of analysis.
No magic answer then, but useful information, useful data to be had if you compare art across all possible contexts.
I think so. And I think, again, to get back to the simple example of the landscape preferences, what you have to do is look at people's preferences across cultures, and you find, for example, as was found in the Komar and Melamed experiment and things that have been done since then, that people who don't even have these kinds of attractive calendar landscapes in the countries where they live still will buy calendars with those landscapes on the calendars. That is to say, it's not simply what you're used to, it's also what you like at some other level. And that's what requires explanation. That's where I think something like Darwinian aesthetics steps in.
Now, before I forget to mention it, I will give you the third 5-word condensation of what I took from the art instinct, and you can tell me how correct it is. Number 5 is something we touched on. Art's not all socially constructed. Little vague, but how is it?
Yes, I think that's fine. It's not all socially constructed. That is to say, it's socially constructed on some deeper structure which is biological and which is adaptive, which actually aided our survival somehow, somewhere, in the Pleistocene, which is why we find it universally in the human condition.
Now, this book, The Art Instinct, has gotten a very big response. I mean, you've cataloged much of it on the website, theartinstinct.com. You link to reviews and all that, and you can find plenty Googling and plenty of commentary and discussion on blogs and so forth. And I wonder, Darwinian evolution has made inroads in so many areas of life. And in so many areas of life, is it uncontroversial now to take Darwinian insights and apply them there? Why is art such a holdout? Why do people get excited specifically about art when you bring Darwinian evolution to it?
Oh, good question again. This is something I have been, of course, thinking about for the last few months since the book came out and these reviews have come out. It's as though some of the hostility, and there's not been a lot of it in the reviews. Robert Fulford in the National Post in Canada wrote the first review of the book to be published, and he said, you wait for it, this book is going to get a lot of bad reviews. And it hasn't gotten a lot of bad reviews. It's gotten about 3 stinker reviews among all of those.
One of them was from the Discovery Institute, so that doesn't count.
Well, that's true. The creationists don't like it. But there was one from the art critic of the Financial Times, who's an art historian, and comments on the fact that this book is not written by an art historian. An art critic and that's a kind of a left-wing critique of the book. There's a right-wing critique of the book from a conservative Catholic critic in the Weekly Standard. And, I've got to say there's some criticism that came in a second Newsweek review, too, from Jeremy McCarter in Newsweek. But particularly the one in the Financial Times is interesting to me because it's as though it is simply offensive to call into question the way in which the experts, the art historians, the art dealers, the curators, the experts have told us what quality is in the arts, what artistic value is. The idea of somebody coming in from the outside with a whole different point of view is dangerous. That word is used. Troubling, that word is used. Why dangerous? Why troubling? Why not just a different view that we could evaluate and sort of think about it? I don't find the opposition to this book dangerous or troubling. I find it rather cliched and humdrum.
See, that review from the FT you mentioned, it sounds like such a quintessentially English criticism, though, to say that this was written by somebody who rose out of his station anyway, because he's not trained as an art critic specifically as we know it.
Yes, I'm rather the wrong class of person, wrong side of the tracks, we might say in the U.S.
The quintessential English crime, yes. Now, what do you think of Of the criticisms you hear, is there anything, and I include challenges you receive at talks, at lectures, is there anything you hear or you have heard that strikes you as, well, touché, maybe you're right about that, maybe I do need to rethink this part?
I certainly would say that there is a particular sentence in the book, in the introduction to the book, where I say carelessly that I think that the arts have taken a wrong turn. I'm going to see, a determination to shock and puzzle has sent much recent art down a wrong path. I meant there to be writing about art theory, and I don't like the appearance of that sentence in the book, and I wish I had not written it and put it there, because it makes it look at that point, although I was not aware of it, when it went through proofs and the book came out. I'm quite aware of it now. It makes it look like I'm trying to dictate what artists should do or how they should paint or what they should do with their writing and their creativity. And I certainly am not in that position at all. There's no way I can dictate to artists, and there's no way that I think art theorists should dictate to artists how they should undertake to create their work. I will say this, however, that if you take something like my critique of Schoenberg in the next to the last chapter of the book, where I try to explain how it is, or at least the basic factors of how it is that we can attain and experience musical pleasure in terms of constantly predicting what the next notes of a melody or a chord progression will be. And then, of course, the composer either gives us a pleasure of fulfillment of the prediction, or it gives us the pleasure of being surprised by something we didn't expect, which is also quite novel and interesting. A lot of music is experienced in terms of novelty and fulfillment. And this is happening at an almost pre-conscious level very fast as we listen to a piece of music. The problem with Schoenberg's 12-tone music is, as I explain in that chapter, it has tone rows where you, in principle, cannot predict what the next note will be. So, in a sense, you can't be surprised, you can't be bored, because you can never predict anyway. And what I argue is that a music which is built, in principle, on a structure of unpredictability will never be a popular or pleasure-giving music, at least for a large number of people. You can memorize what the tone rows are, and in that sense you can sort of be so accustomed to them that you can find some sense of predictability. But for the person for whom that music is new, there's very little pleasure that can be had from it because of the unpredictability of the music. With Beethoven or Schubert, there's a sense in which the music is partially predictable, but not completely, and then Schubert and Beethoven do something totally surprising, and you find it quite very beautiful and very pleasurable. With Schoenberg, you don't get that. Now, what's happened is that people who don't like the book or don't like the general message of the book have glommed onto that and tried to say that I'm saying that Schoenberg is ugly, that I'm saying that music like this can't be written, that I'm trying to constrain what can be done with 12-tone music or in modern music. That's not the case at all. I'm like a doctor diagnosing a disease. You want to have the disease? Fine. It's okay with me. I'm just saying this is what's going on, and this is why Beethoven and Schubert will always be more popular than Schoenberg, no matter how much we try to, acclimatize people to the atmosphere and the melodies or the anti-melodies of Schoenberg. They will never have, for most human minds, the beauty that Schubert can have because of this unpredictability. The analysis itself, since it goes against modernism, is seen as somehow violating the religious tenets of modernism. It is as though modernism's a religion, and I've somehow, blundered in here, and I'm saying things that shouldn't be said.
It does seem, when I see the discussion of the book on the internet, especially with those who haven't read it and kind of don't like the premise already, the book seems to have been boiled down to, and tell me if you've heard this, if you felt the same way, it seems to have been boiled down to Denis Dutton says we should all paint landscapes, essentially.
Yes, that's quite right. Denis Dutton thinks we should all paint landscapes, or this book thinks that only boring melodic music will be of interest to people, or this book is against abstract art. I mean, the book has Jackson Pollock on the first page, for God's sake. But that's forgotten, and the analysis in the first chapter is seen as some kind of validation as pretty picture chocolate box landscapes being the only interesting art in the world, which, of course, is not the case at all. As is pointed out later in that chapter, the way in which, I guess all authors who've written a controversial book have had this happen to them, the way in which people make up their mind, even on the basis of the jacket blurb, what the book is going to say, and then they can read and be completely oblivious to any complexity in the message. That's reductionism, reducing me to some sort of a boogeyman who must be resisted at all costs.
But this isn't even just a simple issue of reductionism. It's missing a very basic thing. They're mistaking a book that is descriptive for a book that is prescriptive, that is normative. Why do you think that basic mistake is happening?
Well, in the first place, I do plead guilty on that one particular sentence, which looks like a prescriptive. It is a prescriptive sentence. The one where I said that a desire to shock has sent art down the wrong road. Desire to shock is actually very good. I mean, Berlioz liked to shock people. Beethoven liked to shock people. Stravinsky shocked people. So I will plead guilty on that one particular sentence. And if there's another revision coming up for this book, you may find that sentence is rewritten. But by and large, I think, Colin, you're quite right to say the book is descriptive. It's trying to describe where aesthetic pleasure comes from, and also where it comes from for the mass of humanity. We can't just simply write off pretty Monet landscapes and calendars and popular arts and expect the only worthwhile things to be said about art will be said about Damien Hirst's Pickled Shark or Duchampian experiments. And we must always respect these things and never criticize them, because if we do that, well, then we're on the side of hoi polloi against the art elite. I mean, I reject these distinctions between high and low art anyway. I mean, this book is about all of the arts at all levels, including the highest levels, which is why the last chapter in the book is called Greatness in the Arts, and it's my characterization of what great art consists in. At that point, I'm drifting, some people have said, nearly free of the earlier chapters in the book. Well, that may be, but I think you have to do that to give some kind of complete account. I mean, if anything, I would say, for example, of Steven Pinker, that the things that Steve has said about the arts in his various writings have tended to be more valid applied to Hollywood movies, pop songs, comic books, and whatever else one would apply his kind of account to. I'm trying to refine the evolutionary account, but apply it to what historically would you consider the more sophisticated arts, including modernism and including Marcel Duchamp, about whom I have a lot to say in the book and for whom I have a great deal of respect.
Although you wouldn't know it from hearing people say Denis Dutton hates Duchamp for Fountain.
Yes, that's right. The Financial Times said that Duchamp gets an entire chapter of abuse, and that's an outrageous misreading of that chapter. I mean, I call him a lucid genius in that chapter. I talk about how witty he is. I talk about the intellectual challenges of his work, and so forth. But because the chapter is not unqualified praise of Duchamp as a genius full stop with nothing else to be said, apparently it was a chapter of abuse. Really, that's outrageous.
How much of this did you see coming, of the misreading that the book has gotten?
I thought it would be worse.
Oh, really? Worse?
Frankly. Yeah, I really thought it would be worse. I thought I would get far more pans. I mean, really, if you look at the reviews, if you look at the Philadelphia Inquirer, which, calling it the aesthetics book of the generation, and the New York Times and the TLS and the Atlantic and the New Yorker, it really is so gratifying to see the number of people who've taken the book in the spirit in which it's offered. I thought there would be more abusive reviews. I will say this, however, I think some of the bad reviews will come later because they'll come in academic journals, small circulation academic journals. And so I expect more trouble. I think the Book Forum review, which is a pan, that was one of the early reviews, and that was a pan from the Book Forum. That's interesting because the woman who wrote it respects the book and disagrees with every word in it. And it's just interesting to see how she comes to completely disagree. I don't think that she's right in almost anything she says. There are disagreements that are actually valuable to have, and people can look at both sides and come out with a better understanding. And I do want that to happen. People will often say, artists often sometimes will produce some awful piece of work, and it'll be excoriated and panned, and the artist will defend what he's done and by saying, well, I really wanted to create controversy. Well, you did that. You could have done a better job of it, too. I didn't write this book to create controversy. I wrote it because I think there's another new way to look at the arts. But the controversy is healthy.
If you're just tuning in, it's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Find more information about the program at our website, colinmarshallradio.com, as well as our complete interview archive, other podcasts, and more. My guest is Denis Dutton, professor of the philosophy of art at the University of Canterbury and the founder, editor, and presiding spirit of Arts and Letters Daily. His new book is The Art Instinct, Beauty, Pleasure, and Human Evolution. The Book Forum review, since we brought it up, I was thinking about that review, and tell me if you felt the same way, but it struck me as it's kind of a classic technique that I see coming from the humanities side of things quite often whenever evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology more broadly gets brought into the picture. They say, well, how do you know? Well, how do you know? How do you know? And it kind of picks away at it, or tries to pick away at it little by little. Did you feel that was kind of what was going on?
Yes, I feel there's often a how do you know how people lived in the Pleistocene? Well, you don't know completely how people lived in the Pleistocene, but you have an archaeological record which has bearing on how they lived, and you have a record of hunter-gatherer groups, records going back for 200 years, but even well into the 20th century, how hunter-gatherer groups, which were like Pleistocene hunter-gatherer groups, lived. And you can put all this information together and I think get a pretty good picture of how life was lived 50 or 75,000 years ago when we were evolving our artistic tastes. I mean, that's one thing. Say, how do you know that? How do you know, and then, about cross-cultural aesthetics? Well, study cross-cultural aesthetics. I have, as you know, spent many years studying the Indian sitar, in addition to studying the whole history of Western classical music as well, and I'm a little bit of a pianist. You can read literatures cross-culturally. You can read them in foreign languages. These things are possible to do. But, of course, if you have your mind made up that every culture lives in its own little hermetically sealed jar and can't communicate with any other culture, then, well, your mind is made up. But the evidence is against it. We know music goes around the world. We know that Brazilians love Japanese Prince. We know that the Japanese love Beethoven. We know that Shakespeare is adored everywhere and that Hollywood movies, have taken off everywhere they're allowed to go. So, I mean, given that, it seems to me that what we have to explain is the universality of art, not the occasional cross-cultural misunderstandings that we encounter when art does cross cultural boundaries.
Just thinking about the fact that of the negative reviews, of which there have been few, we'll reemphasize, not many in all that the book has gotten. One, as we said, came from Book Forum, one came from the Discovery Institute, and it strikes me that the practice of asking from the Book Forum types, how do you know this, how do you know this, how do you know this, is it really that different from an evolution denier going to the fossil record and saying, what's between those? Well, what's between those? Well, what's between those?
Yes, I quite agree. There is a sense in which some of the same arguing from ignorance, you can't really know this, you can't really know that, is similar both from the left and the right in criticisms of my book. But I would point out that Darwin endured the same thing in his lifetime. That is to say, it was said to Darwin, look, there are chimpanzees and there's us and there's nothing in between, and you have no evidence that there's anything in between. And what he was doing was he was looking at other animals, he was looking at the makeup of the human organism, and he was reverse engineering where our characteristics would have had to come from. And in due course, not in his lifetime, in due course, however, up through the 20th century, we have a huge amount of information about our near, now extinct human ancestors in Africa and outside of Africa, that preceded us, and not only the Neanderthals, but our direct ancestors in Africa. And the idea that, well, of course, you don't know this, you don't know that. A lot is there to be known. There's a lot that's going to be known in the future that I can't guess. And I am quite confident that given the universality of the arts, given the fact that they produce so much pleasure, given the fact that they spontaneously occur everywhere in the world, that more information is going to be found out about this, just as it was about the basic evolution of the human body. We're going to know more about this in the future. But we have to open our minds to the possibility that there are innate structures that cause these universal responses.
I'd like to know, considering all of the traveling you've done promoting this book, all of the conversations you've had, all of the debates you've had, I'm sure, what sorts of groups respond most to this book? And this is given rise by the experience that I had and that you had as well when you came to UCSB early on in the promotion of the book and gave a talk to a group of grad students and myself. I'm not a grad student, but I was there, about the art instinct. And you asked how many people here are from biology of some sort, and most of the hands were raised. How many philosophers are here? And no hands were raised. Have any philosophers come on board, or are they kind of staying off the boat?
No, I think philosophers are coming around to this. I mean, I think that was a bit atypical at UC Santa Barbara. When I went to NYU, philosophers did turn out in large numbers, and it was standing room and sitting in the aisles in a fairly large lecture hall. So it depends on I think where you are and perhaps how things are promoted. Goodness gracious, but philosophers are recognizing the naturalistic roots of human value systems. That is to say, a lot of people doing ethics and moral philosophy now are looking at evolution and the evolution of moral values. I think there's going to be more work done on that in the future. We're not stuck simply with rehashing Aristotle versus Kant versus Mill over and over again, which is, those sort of three pillar posts or what support most modern ethical theory of one kind and another. I think evolution is going to supersede a lot of these arguments, and it's going to do the same thing in aesthetics as well. As I say in the book, and as I think is so important, is that the problem with aesthetic theory is that we have been obsessed for the last 30 or 40 years by a tiny class of examples. Duchamp's fountain, the urinal put on a plinth and signed R. Mutt, and his other ready-mades, things like Damien Hirst's experiments, Tracy Eamon's unmade bed, abstraction in general, and the obsession with a tiny group of historically very strange examples. Behind it, there seems to be this idea that, well, if we could explain why a shark pickled in a tank of formaldehyde is a work of art, then everything else would fall into place. And of course, what my book says is, no, tell me first why the View of Toledo or the Pastoral Symphony or the Iliad is a work of art. Let's worry about the paradigm cases, the cases of uncontroversial, undisputed beauty. Let's explain why those are works of art, and then we can move out to the marginal cases. But what's happened is that academics have just been obsessed with the marginal cases, and they've let the canon sort of fall by the wayside.
Is this because maybe careers are built on edge cases or something like that?
It's in part, I think, because if you teach aesthetics at a university, some of the best examples that you can use to create discussion are these kind of ordinary middle-class values, outrageous cases. So people do enjoy talking about Duchamp, just like they enjoy talking about forgery. What's the difference between a work that is an accepted work of art and a forgery if you can't see the difference? That's a great way to get discussion going, just as it's a great way to use Duchamp to get discussion going. But the concern with these cases seems to have bled over into a sort of the general structure of art theory itself, and I think it's been a bit of a mistake. Oh, I mean, having said that, one has to say that a lot has been written in the last years on these subjects by people like Arthur Danto, and it's very much worth reading and very enjoyable. I mean, I don't knock Danto, except that I think we've got, having been there and done that, it's time for us to go someplace else.
This may be a big thing to ask, but it's a concept you address directly in your book, if I'm not mistaken, that when a philosopher is discussing something, they, by and large, are more concerned with taking their own instincts and upon those instincts building an intellectual superstructure of principles, but they don't seem to care about the origin of those instincts. Now, why don't they care? I mean, I'm outside of philosophy. You're inside it. Do you have an answer?
Well, of course, they wouldn't call them instincts. They'd call them intuitions. But what you say is quite right. If you go back in ordinary language philosophy through, back into the 1950s, and I'm sure you could trace this back to the Greeks if you cared to, people would analyze speech acts in terms of what made sense and what didn't make sense. If someone were to say, "It is raining, but I don't believe it," well, that would be very odd, wouldn't it? How odd. To call something odd is a way of marking it as being of philosophical interest. Well, a lot of the things that we find odd or we find not odd have to do with basic intuitions we have, let's say if it's aesthetics we're talking about, but the same would be for ethics as well. A lot of the things that we find odd or find unseemly or make us feel a bit queasy or we find fulfilling or right or normal, these things involve intuitions. Now, I would argue that some of these intuitions actually are ways of channeling or exemplify basic instincts, basic innate inclinations, which are Pleistocene instincts, which are what make the basic human personality what it is. The way philosophers treat these things is to try to turn them into somehow logical systems, and if they can show a coherent logical system that underlies, let's say, some set of tastes, they've explained it. Well, I don't think so. I mean, we didn't evolve all of our moral values, for example, to be consistent with one another. We are, for example, hardwired nepotists. We tend to favor our own children and our own family members in situations where we can do so. And that's why we have to have, for example, laws against nepotism in public life, because at the same time we're in favor of fairness. Well, basic public fairness versus nepotism are two colliding fundamental, I think, Pleistocene instincts that we have as hunter-gatherers. Do you favor your own children, or do you treat all children equally in the tribe? To some extent, you do both, depending on the situation. But this is not something that can be accounted for simply in terms of some kind of logical system. It has to involve some reference to how we evolved and the values that we evolved as Homo sapiens.
Now, how do artists respond to this book, actual makers of art? Because I've not heard from many of them about it, but I'm sure you have.
I have, and the response has been very positive. I've gotten praise, I've gotten gushing emails, but I say that with this proviso. I have the feeling that many of the artists who've written me and who've read either excerpts of the book or bought the book and read it are people who themselves feel shut out from the art world. So they're saying, look, here's a book that validates a lot of the intuitions I have about art, but doesn't found them in some kind of an elitist art world, sees them as evolved and as something that all human beings share. And they like that. They like the anti-elitism of the book. And, of course, if they happen to be landscape artists, as landscape specialists, realistic landscape specialists on the side, that helps too, let's face it. Where I'm not sure I would get support would be from professional, practicing, highly successful, how shall I say, modernist or postmodernist artists whose sense of fulfillment involves the validation of the art world at large. or the important, let's say, New York art world. In other words, I don't expect that Tracy Emin or Damien Hirst are going to write me any love letters for this book.
I was going to say the kind of artist that Charles Saatchi would buy is not going to be one that would like this book.
Exactly. That's perfectly put. It's the Saatchi artists I do not expect, although I do have an invitation from the Saatchi Journal in London to write a piece for them because they're impressed by the book and would like me to write something, and I intend to do so. but by and large, you can sort of see, based, for example, on the first chapter of the book, why that might play to people who feel that they're outsiders and like realism in painting and like painting landscapes. Now, what's wrong with that, I say? They're artists. It's a democracy. They're human beings. They have values. Sure, you can look down your nose at Sunday painters who are rank amateurs, but on the other hand, everyone has a place in the world of art. It's huge, it's multifarious, it's shining, it's exuberant, it's wasteful, and it's very interesting. And that's what I'm trying to approach in general in the book, and not simply to write something which validates what New York intellectuals and critics would say is art.
The hourglass is quickly getting the grains of sand running through it, but I wanted to make sure to ask you, this book, The Art Instinct, it's a bit of an outlier if one looks at your career or the information they can find about it, because of course you've done things that people love. You do arts and letters daily, and you put out philosophy and literature, but this big event book that gets so much coverage and is so successful, and you're on the Colbert Report, this must feel like a stark change of pace for you.
Oh, it's like being struck by lightning, Colin. I can't tell you. I mean, I didn't expect this. The publisher I think kind of did expect it, but the publisher somehow knows things better than I do. There are chapters of this book that have been published in philosophy journals, 2 of them in any event. They're relatively unchanged. It wasn't as though this is a popularized version of the thesis. I wrote this book directly for my colleagues, and I am as surprised by the popular reception as anyone. I do try to write clearly. I mean, the book, it does attempt to make the argument clear to anybody who's willing to pick it up and give it some thought. It doesn't require knowledge of jargon or some specialized knowledge in order to make sense of what it says. But I must tell you, although I have been working for many years on this, and as a person who does the philosophy of art and aesthetics professionally, I've had a long interest in trying to mount this argument, and finally felt ready to do it after all these years. I'm quite surprised by the response. I'm astonished, gobsmacked, as people say in New Zealand.
Was there any individual associated with this project who seemed to simply incisively see that there was a huge market for, of all things, a book about the philosophy of art written by a man who had not written a popular book before?
Well, I think it was my agent, John Brockman. I think he saw that, and so did my editors, Peter Guinet from Bloomsbury Press in New York and Lata Menon from Oxford University Press in Britain. Those are the 3 people who seem to recognize what the potential of the book. I think rather more than I did, and I give them credit. But of course, they are more experienced with the actual making and carrying books out to the public than I am. So that is their expertise. I'm just the guy who writes in this subject, in this area.
I want to squeeze one last question in about this process, because I have to know, what really surprised you about the process of conceiving and bringing this book to market, and the whole process? What was the most unexpected element here in the birth of The Art Instinct?
I don't know that there was anything that was completely unexpected in it. I will say this, though. I do think that the book in 10 chapters does present a cumulative argument. And I think maybe what I'm surprised about is that there is, over the whole of this argument, a coherence and a direction, which I felt in my own mind all the way through it. But I wasn't sure if that would come out in the book. And I think people who've read the book feel that it does make a coherent argument. Of course, it's based in two basic areas, that is, say, natural selection, which is the basis of the arts, but also sexual selection, which explains why the arts are so gaudy and overdone and flashy and shiny and show-offy. But you put them all together, and it does give there's a unity to the view. And if you can achieve that kind of unity, and if I have, I'm maybe just 0.1% on my way to the achievement of the greatest mind, the greatest unifying mind, I think, of the modern world in understanding the human condition, and that is Charles Darwin's mind. Darwin's theory of evolution gives a huge, gigantic, coherent, and unified view of the condition of life on Earth and of the human condition. We know a lot about life on Earth, but we're just beginning to apply Darwin to the human condition. And my book, The Art Instinct, is intended as a step in that direction.
Well, I can't think of any more majestic a note to go out on. The book, once again, is The Art Instinct, Beauty, Pleasure, and Human Evolution. Dennis, thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Thank you, Colin. A delightful occasion to be here.
For more information on Denis Dutton and The Art Instinct, visit theartinstinct.com. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. Our theme music is produced by Ben Althouse. Hear more of his stuff at benalthouse.com. And for our complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com, as well as other podcasts and more. All that can be found there. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.